Hi, lovies. I need to give a quick trigger warning at the beginning for discussions of eugenics, forced sterilization, institutionalization, mental abuse, and the murder of disabled adults and children. Please make sure you're monitoring your regulation while you're listening, and if you need to take breaks, please go ahead and do that. If you need to vent or reach out for support, I'm always waiting for you guys at my message boards. I hope you find this episode valuable. Welcome back to your newest obsession, the NeuroSpicy MomPod. As always, I'm your host, Austin Marie, and I am so glad you're here. If you're new around here, this is our little corner of the internet where we explore neurodivergence, psychology, neuroscience, reparenting, healing, and all of the messy, complicated ways those things show up in real life. My goal is to help you understand how your brain works so you can understand yourself with a little more compassion. Because when we understand our nervous systems and the systems we've been shaped by, we can start making choices from a place of awareness instead of survival. So whether you're folding laundry, cleaning the kitchen, driving to work, or just trying to keep cool in this heat, I'm really glad you're spending this time with me. If you've been a part of this NeuroSpicy baddie crew with me for a while, you know that I have a really hard time keeping my opinions to myself when it comes to anything related to justice. This is heightened even more when it involves children or nature. Basically, anyone or anything that cannot speak for itself will automatically trigger something in me that morphs me from this insecure, nervous, shy person into a loud, confrontational social justice warrior, which sidebar, the first time I actually heard the term social justice warrior, it was with my then bestie who was using the term in like a derogatory way. And when I asked her to explain like what it was, I laughed with her oh, ha, ha, ha. But in my mind, I was so confused as to why that was a bad thing. So I'm sure it's shocking to no one that we no longer speak. But anyways, I have been losing a lot of followers and have been living in the shadow band that is my social media because I am not able to not say anything about what's happening around us in every aspect of the word, in our international politics, in our national politics, in our local politics. But the one that looms the darkest in my mind is our poor climate and the rights of the most vulnerable. So for today's episode, I want to turn our attention to the legality of being neurodivergent. I know that I did a history of neurodivergence episode last season, but I want to go a little deeper into what is currently at stake and the history behind why it's so important we all understand what is happening. We've all seen shows or movies that use mental institutions as the setting for their spooky, scary stories, but the real stories of those institutions are not far in our past. And unfortunately, this is not the first time in our modern history that people with disabilities or differences have had to fight for their rights and their dignity. I have always been under the firm belief that one thing no one can take from you is your knowledge. And the more we know, the more powerful we become. So let's take a moment today to focus on the history of the legality of neurodivergence. There's a lot of downplaying of what is happening in America right now. Growing up undiagnosed and having my concerns and my pattern recognition ignored is truly nothing new. But I think it's important now that we all understand how deep this actually is. Because if we do not learn our history, we are doomed to repeat it, or whatever that quote is. So let's jump back in time, but not so far back, to the year 1939. And if you're a history buff, you may be getting uncomfortable. Good. Sit with it because we should all be very uncomfortable with what's happening. I want to talk about two programs called the Euthanasia Program and Aktion T4. The literal meaning of the word euthanasia is good death and generally refers to causing a painless death for someone who is chronically or terminally ill and would otherwise suffer. But that is not the way the word was being used in this context. The Nazis used the word euthanasia as a euphemism for a covert murder program that was used to target patients with mental and physical disabilities living in institutional settings in Germany and German annexed territories for systematic killing. Like I mentioned earlier, this started in 1939, which was about 2 years before the systematic murder of the European Jewish population as part of the final solution. This program was one of many radical eugenic measures that were meant to restore the racial integrity of the German nation. Its main goal was to eliminate those who were considered life unworthy of life, which included people with severe psychiatric, neurological, or physical disabilities, whom supporters of the Nazi movement believed were genetically and financial burdens to their society and state. And the way this killing program began was in the most insidious way, by requiring all nurses, midwives, and physicians to report newborns and children under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe mental or physical disability. Within a couple of months, public health authorities began encouraging parents of children with disabilities to send them to specially designed pediatric clinics. But in reality, those clinics were killing wards with specially recruited medical staff waiting there, murdering their young patients with lethal overdoses or even by starvation. This program began with infants and toddlers, but soon widened its scope to include children up to 17 years old. The conservative estimate is that 10,000 children lost their lives due to the first phase of the euthanasia program. Seeing how successful the children's euthanasia program was, the Nazi regime used this framework as they turned their focus to adults with disabilities. In 1939, Hitler signed a secret authorization to protect any physicians, medical staff, and medical administrators from prosecution who participated in this program that was dubbed T4. T4 operatives established 6 gassing installations with connecting crematories. The program started as insidiously as the children's euthanasia program. Under the guise of collecting statistical data, T4 operatives began distributing specific questionnaires to all public health officials, public and private hospitals, mental institutions, and nursing homes. Included in the questionnaire was an emphasis on the patient's capacity to work. Cue RFK's speech implying that people with autism were a burden because they would never be able to pay tax dollars. Using these forms, beginning in January of 1940, patients who were selected for the euthanasia program were removed from their home institutions and taken to their nearest gassing installation. Their families would later be sent ashes in an urn, along with a death certificate listing a fictive cause and date of death. T4's own internal calculations estimate that this program claimed the lives of about 70,000 mentally and physically disabled persons from January 1940 through August 1941. Knowing this little slice of history, it is now crystal clear the concern that parents have with the current Department of Health and Human Services trying to create an autism database where it would team up with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to create a database utilizing insurance claims, electronic medical records, and data from wearable devices with health sensors. And before anyone hears that comparison and immediately thinks I'm being dramatic, I need us to understand something incredibly important. I'm not telling you that collecting health data is the same thing as Aktion T4. I'm telling you that history gives us a responsibility to pay attention to the systems being built around vulnerable populations, the language being used to describe those populations, and who is being given the power to decide what happens with that information. Because this story also does not belong exclusively to Nazi Germany. And if we want to understand how we got here, we need to bring this conversation home to the United States. This is where I learned something that made the imaginary string in my brain light the fuck up, because while Nazi Germany took eugenics to an incomprehensibly horrific extreme, eugenics was already a thriving movement here in America. The United States has been passing laws based on the idea that certain kinds of people were genetically undesirable long before Aktion T4 even began. And once again, disability was right there in the middle of it. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the American eugenics movement promoted the idea that humanity could essentially be improved through selective reproduction. People considered intelligent, healthy, productive, and socially desirable should reproduce, while people considered unfit should not. And I want you to pay attention to that word, unfit. Because unfit wasn't limited to one neatly defined medical diagnosis. Eugenic thinking became entangled with disability, mental illness, intellectual disability, poverty, criminality, race, immigration, and this much larger cultural obsession with deciding which human beings were contributing appropriately to society. Eventually, those beliefs stopped being merely beliefs. They became law. In 1907, Indiana became the first state in the country to enact a compulsory eugenic sterilization law. Other states followed. And eventually, tens of thousands of Americans would be sterilized under laws created to prevent people considered genetically or socially unfit from reproducing. And then in 1927, the question of whether the government could legally do this reached the United States Supreme Court. The case was called Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was a young woman in Virginia who had been institutionalized at the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. And I wanted to pause on that language there because those are the actual kinds of classifications human beings were being given by the state. According to the doctor who sterilized her, Buck was incorrigible, and apparently society just could not have that. Carrie Buck had become pregnant after being raped by a relative of her foster family. Rather than being treated as the victim of sexual violence that she was institutionalized and labeled feeble-minded. Georgia had recently passed a law allowing the compulsory sterilization of certain people living in state institutions, and Carrie Buck became the test case for whether that law violated the Constitution. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 that Virginia could sterilize her. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., writing for the majority, gave us one of the most horrifying sentences I have ever read in a Supreme Court opinion. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck was sterilized. And this is the part I really want us to sit with. This wasn't happening secretly. This wasn't some rogue physician operating outside the law. The legislator created the law, but actually, even that sentence lets them off a little too easily because Virginia didn't just create this law in a vacuum. Doctors and institutional leaders were already pushing the boundaries of what they could legally do to the people in their care, and the sterilization law gave them a legal framework and legal protection to continue doing it. So legislators weren't stepping in to protect vulnerable people from doctors with an absolutely terrifying amount of power over their bodies. They were helping protect the people exercising that power. Institutions identified the people subjected to it. Doctors participated in the system. Legislators gave that system the protection of law. And when the constitutionality of that system finally reached the highest court in the United States, 8 Supreme Court justices said yes. The government can do this. Our government did. And if you're listening to me from California, we are unfortunately not innocent bystanders in this history either. California became one of the most aggressive sterilization states in the country. Researchers estimate that approximately 20,000 people were sterilized in California state institutions under eugenic laws during the 20th century. 20,000 people. And again, look at the language surrounding these politics. People were described as defective, unfit, a burden, incapable of contributing appropriately to society. There is that imaginary string again, because when I hear a government official discussing autistic people by pointing out that some of them may never work, may never live independently, may never pay taxes, I don't hear those words floating around without that historical context. I cannot. Once you know how often disabled people's humanity has been measured against their economic productivity, you cannot unknow it. And that doesn't mean every government database becomes a killing list. It doesn't mean every offensive statement inevitably ends in the worst possible outcome. History does not repeat itself like we're all trapped in some fucked up rerun where every scene happens exactly the same way. But history does give us patterns. It gives us language to recognize and systems to recognize. And it shows us what can happen when a society slowly becomes comfortable with the premise that some human beings are inherently more valuable than others. That is why I keep coming back to legality, because rights do not only disappear when somebody announces, hey guys, we're taking away your rights now. Sometimes the law itself is the thing denying you the right. And sometimes the right technically exists on paper, but people have to fight like hell to make the government honor it. Which brings us to the other half of this history, because disabled Americans did eventually start fighting back. This is an incredibly important part of the story, particularly because of the way we tend to teach American history as though progress is something that simply happens to us. We move from one chapter to the next. The terrible thing happened. People eventually realized it was terrible. Somebody passed a law. And now we live in the better part of the timeline. It creates this very comfortable illusion that civil rights naturally expand as societies become more enlightened, when the reality is significantly messier. The protections disabled Americans have today did not emerge because the government spontaneously developed a conscience. They exist because disabled people, their families, attorneys, organizers, and communities spent decades forcing institutions to recognize that disability does not negate someone's constitutional or civil rights. This is also where America's genuinely impressive ability to rebrand itself becomes relevant again, because we have managed to package so much of our disability history as evidence of how far we have come without spending nearly enough time talking about who had to drag us here. We remember the ADA as this landmark piece of bipartisan legislation signed into law in 1990, which it absolutely was. But the legislation did not materialize out of some collective national realization that disabled people deserved equality. It was built on decades of organizing, litigation, civil disobedience, and disabled people repeatedly demanding access to a society that had been deliberately designed to exclude them. One of the earliest legal shifts came through challenges to institutionalization itself. In 1975, the Supreme Court decided in O'Connor versus Donaldson, a case involving Kenneth Donaldson, who had spent nearly 15 years confined in a Florida state hospital despite not being considered dangerous and despite having people willing to help him live outside the institution. The Supreme Court ultimately held that a state could not constitutionally confine a non-dangerous person who was capable of surviving safely outside an institution simply because that person had a mental illness. I want you to think about how profound that distinction actually is, because for much of the history we have been discussing, the presence of a disability or psychiatric diagnosis had functioned almost like permission for the state to assume control over someone's life. Suddenly, the legal question was beginning to shift away from what should society do with this person and toward what authority does the government actually have to take this person's liberty away. That same transformation was happening within the broader disability rights movement. In 1973, Congress passed the Rehabilitation Act, and tucked inside it was Section 504, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of disability in programs receiving federal financial assistance. If that sounds like very dry legislative language, I promise you that the implications were anything but dry. Section 504 helped establish disability discrimination as a civil rights issue, meaning disabled people were not simply asking society to be compassionate towards them. They were asserting that exclusion itself could constitute discrimination. Except passing the law and actually enforcing the law turned out to be two very different things. For years, the federal government failed to issue the regulations necessary to meaningfully implement Section 504. So in 1977, disabled activists organized demonstrations around the country demanding that the government enforce the protections it had already enacted. In San Francisco, activists occupied a federal building for 25 days, creating what became the longest occupation of a federal building in United States history at that time. Many of the protesters had significant disabilities and required medications, attendants, interpreters, accessible food, and other forms of support. Yet they stayed. Community organizations brought supplies, allies helped sustain the occupation, and the protesters refused to leave until the federal government stopped treating their civil rights as something indefinitely negotiable. And eventually, the regulations were signed. That piece of history matters because it complicates this comforting idea that having a right written somewhere means the work is finished. Section 504 already existed while those protesters were occupying that building. Congress had already acted. The language was already on paper. What was missing was implementation, enforcement, and political willingness. And disabled Americans had to organize in order to close the distance between a theoretical right and a right they could actually exercise. That organizing continued, and in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act expanded federal civil rights protections across employment, state, and local government services, public accommodations, transportation, and telecommunications. For those of us who have spent most or all of our lives on this side of the ADA, it can be remarkably easy to experience accommodations as though they are simply part of the natural architecture of modern American life. The ramp is there. The employer has an accommodation process. The school has a 504 coordinator. The public building has an accessible entrance. We inherit the outcome without necessarily inheriting the memory of the fight that created it. And I think forgetting the fight can be dangerous because it allows us to confuse established rights with permanent rights. Laws are not laws of nature. They are agreements made by human beings, interpreted by courts, implemented through agencies, funded through budgets, enforced by administrations, and protected or weakened through political choices. That does not mean an administration can wake up tomorrow morning and simply erase every disability protection in the United States with a stroke of a Sharpie. And I don't want to create this kind of panic because that isn't how our legal system works. There are statutes, courts, states, regulations, advocacy organizations, procedural requirements, and constitutional protections that matter enormously. But I also don't think history gives us the luxury of assuming that because a protection exists today, no one will ever attempt to narrow it tomorrow. And this is where we come back to 2026. When I hear the Secretary of Health and Human Services publicly describe autistic people through their presumed inability to work, live independently, form relationships, or pay taxes, that language does not exist in a historical vacuum for me. When the same department begins assembling enormous data sets about autistic Americans using government healthcare information, I want to know exactly what information is being collected, how will it be used, and who will have access to it, how it will be protected, and what limitations exist on the future uses. Asking those questions is not the same thing as claiming that a healthcare database is Aktion T4. That distinction is important. The point of knowing history is not to insist that every new event is identical to an old one. The point is that history gives us enough context to recognize which questions we should be asking before the answer becomes consequential. The pattern I keep returning to throughout this episode is not simply disability discrimination. It is the relationship between disability, productivity, state power, and human worth. We have repeatedly seen what happens when governments begin categorizing certain populations according to how expensive they are, how productive they are, how independent they are, or how much support they require. We have also seen what happens when the people being categorized have very little influence over the systems doing the categorizing. This is where our tendency to sanitize American history becomes particularly dangerous. We have done an almost spectacular job of exporting the visual imagery of eugenics into Nazi Germany while forgetting that American lawmakers, physicians, universities, institutions, and courts participated in their own eugenic project. We remember the Nazis as the warning without remembering all of the American choices that should also be warnings. Then we tell ourselves that because we eventually passed the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA, the story has reached its moral conclusion. It hasn't. Civil rights do not have a final chapter. Every generation inherits protections that somebody before them fought to establish. And then that generation gets to decide whether it's going to understand those protections well enough to defend them. That does not require living in constant state of political panic. And frankly, I don't think any of our nervous systems need another reason to do that. What it does require is something much less dramatic and much more useful: informed participation. So I want to leave you with 3 places to begin, because after spending this much time talking about the ways governments have failed disabled people, it would be irresponsible of me to leave you with only fear. Nationally, learn who represents you and pay attention specifically to legislation, regulations, budgets, and federal policies affecting disability rights. You do not need to become an expert on every political issue occurring simultaneously. That sounds like an excellent way to destroy your mental health. But choose the areas that do directly affect you or the people you love. If that is Medicaid, follow Medicaid. If it is Section 504, healthcare, privacy, the ADA, or federal disability services, follow those. When something changes, contact the people who represent you and tell them precisely what you expect from them. Representatives need to hear from disabled constituents and families before a policy becomes an emergency, not only afterward. Locally, find the disability rights organizations that are already translating enormous pieces of legislation and government bureaucracy into information normal human beings can actually use. Here in California, Disability Rights California tracks legislation, state budgets, education, healthcare, housing, developmental disability services, mental health policy, and other issues affecting disabled Californians. Get on the email list, follow the organizations, pay attention to your school board, county supervisors, regional centers, and local agencies when decisions affecting disabled people appear on their agendas. Advocacy does not always look like marching through Washington with a handmade sign. Sometimes it looks like being one of 30 parents who showed up to a school board meeting on a Tuesday night and makes it politically inconvenient to quietly eliminate a service. And finally, protect yourself by understanding and documenting the rights you already have. If you have workplace accommodations, keep copies of the correspondence. If your child has an IEP or a 504 plan, keep the evaluations, meeting notes, notices, and plans somewhere you can actually access them. Remember, write everything down. If you receive disability-related services, understand which agencies provide them and what processes exist if those services are reduced or denied. Bureaucracy has been one of the recurring characters in this entire episode, and while paperwork has historically been used as a mechanism of control, documentation can also become evidence, accountability, and protection. When somebody attempts to deny you something the law says you are entitled to. None of those actions are particularly glamorous, but that might actually be the point. Protecting civil rights rarely looks as cinematic while it is happening as it does when we package it into a documentary 50 years later. Most of the time, it looks like people reading things they would rather not read, showing up to meetings they really don't want to be at, making phone calls that make them uncomfortable, and keeping records they wish they didn't need to, and refusing to assume that somebody else will notice the problem first. And maybe that's the piece of history I want us to remember. The people who eventually became the heroes in our history books that did not have the luxury of knowing how the chapter ended while they were living through it. They were looking at the information available to them, recognizing the patterns, deciding what they believed was worth protecting, and acting accordingly. We have the same responsibility now. I know that this was not exactly the lightest or most entertaining episode we have ever done together, but I really appreciate you staying with me through this one, because I think conversations like this matter precisely because they are uncomfortable. It is very easy to care about our rights once they are threatened in a way that directly affects us. It is much harder and much more important to understand how those rights were built, who had to fight for them, and what warning signs deserve our attention before we personally become the person standing in the line of fire. And if this episode gave you something to think about, please help me get it outside of this little corner of the internet. Like the episode, leave a comment or a review, share it to your stories, or send it directly to a friend who is always willing to follow the imaginary string with you. Those tiny actions are what help independent podcasts like this reach people without a giant media company, an advertising budget, or some mysterious algorithm deciding I am suddenly worthy of being perceived. And if you want to help build this community beyond the podcast itself, you can join us over on Patreon, where you can follow along for free, or if you're able and feel called to financially support the work here, there are paid options too. Every subscription, every share, every comment, and every person who chooses to participate in this community helps me continue building something that I genuinely believe we are going to need more and more of. Spaces where people can learn from each other, care for each other, share resources, ask questions, and remember that none of us are supposed to be navigating all of this alone. I am endlessly grateful for the people who keep showing up here, especially because I know there are approximately 8 million things competing for your attention at any given moment. Your continued support of this podcast and your collective belief in what we are creating together means more to me than I know how to articulate without getting aggressively sentimental, so I will simply say thank you. I really do believe that whatever the next few years ask of us, it is going to be communities that carry people through it, not institutions swooping in at the perfect moment, not some magical politician arriving to save everybody. It'll be people checking on their neighbors, parents sharing resources with other parents, disabled people teaching others how to advocate, someone making the phone call for the friend who cannot make it themselves, someone bringing dinner, someone saying, "Hey, I noticed this too." Communities lifting each other up. That is the part of history I want us to repeat. So if you are not staying with me for this week's journal prompt, this is where I will leave you. Thank you again for spending this time with me. Thank you for continuing to learn alongside me, and please take care of yourself and each other. I love you dearly, and I will meet you right back here next week. For my journal baddies who are still here, grab your notebook, the notes app on your phone, or the back of the receipt that has been living in your purse for the last 6 months, whatever works. After everything we talked about today, I do not want the prompt to be about fear. I want it to be about awareness and responsibility, because there is a difference between carrying the weight of an entire world and recognizing the small part of it that is actually within your reach. So your journal prompt for this week is, what right, protection, or freedom have I unconsciously treated as permanent simply because I have never lived without it? And what is one concrete way I can participate in protecting it for myself, my community, or the people who come after me? Remember, you do not have to come away from that question with an entire advocacy plan. Maybe your answer is that you need to learn more about your child's rights at school. Maybe you realize you have never actually looked up who represents you locally. Maybe it's joining an organization or making one phone call, keeping better documentation, or checking in on someone in your community, or simply learning the history of a right you've always assumed would be there. The point is not to leave your journal feeling responsible for fixing everything. The point is to leave it knowing where you stand. That way, you will be able to recognize the imaginary strings connecting decisions, rhetoric, systems, and consequences that might otherwise look completely unrelated. And perhaps most importantly, knowing our history makes us a whole lot harder to fool. I love you all so much. Take care of yourself this week, my friends, and take care of your nervous systems. Ta-ta!